Scary Reddit Stories Part 71. When I was around 11 to 12 years old, my friend Alex and I had these huge woods around us that we never ever came close to finding the edge of. We would wake up in the morning early when school was out and we would spend the whole day out exploring the woods. This being the 80s and Alex and I being smart enough kids, our parents had no problem with this. One day we find a treehouse deep into the woods in a part that we have never been to before. Probably about a 2-hour trek from the edge of the neighborhood. It was seriously a kid's dream. This treehouse is probably 30 feet off the ground, but it looks solid. We are so stoked to find our new castle. We hightail it back home to get some rope, and my pops takes us down to the surplus store, and over dinner Alex and I can't shut up about it. Next day comes, and we hike out at almost dawn. We got a backpack full of rope and sandwiches and our knives on our hips and excitement that's so thick we could chew on it. We make it out there and start attaching rungs made from big sticks onto one end of the rope. It took us a good few hours but we get one side finished and the rope tossed over the branch that's where the little deck and door are. We finally climb up and we are sitting on the deck looking out and rock, paper, scissors for who gets to go in first. Alex wins and goes in and comes right out. He's white as a sheet and wants to go home. So curious as I am I go inside. This treehouse is probably 8x8 and about 7 to 8 high inside. The inside walls are covered, every single inch, of naked girls. Not awesome found Playboy magazines, but Kitty P0RN. I think the oldest kids were about my age, but it was Polaroids and glossy magazine pages, stuck perfectly up with staples and filling the walls up. Alex and I got back home as quick as we could. We informed my pops about it and he calls the cops. The officer shows up and asks us a few questions like where it is, how did we get up there, where did we buy the rope, did we take any pictures off the wall. He got increasingly rude about it and my pops put an end to it. He left with our statement and said he would be in touch. We were no longer allowed to be out in the woods for more than an hour without checking in. About a year or two later that same cop stopped me when I was hanging out in a different park, saw me smoking, and caught me with a joint. Alex asked him whatever happened with the treehouse. The cop told us to not do drugs and left us alone. In college many moons later, Alex sent me an email saying how he read in the big state paper that officer SH0T himself with his service revolver after his wife found out he was circulating CP. So, it comes to my mind like it came to Alex's that we had found his little CP stash cave. The creepy part came a few months later when Alex sent me another email saying that he went to the estate auction and one of the items for sale was a rope ladder with a bag. Scary Reddit Stories Part 73. This happened in Townsend, Massachusetts in the late 80s. My parents' lawyer comes home from work to find his wife and 2 kids are at bed in DR01 in bathtubs. When the news hit the next morning, there were no suspects. People were freaking out. This was a huge thing in our town of 8,000 people. Nobody used to lock their doors, but I remember my father putting deadbolts on that very afternoon. Everybody in school was scared shitless. Then the next day came, and we find out that the suspect was this 17-year-old kid Danny LaPlante. Every kid knew who that was, he was that one everyone was scared of, because he seemed wrong. I remember the few friends Danny had was taunting a kid, mean, but harmless in retrospect, when Danny came out of nowhere and broke his arm. It was reckless, and he was only 13 at the time. Things got even scarier, because they couldn't find him. Word was that he knew the woods like the back of his hand, and he was running around out there. That scared the shit out of me, because our house was right against wilderness. At night I snuck down to the basement, grabbed my dad's machete, and put it under my bed. Finally, they caught him. And then the news came out with a terrifying crime he committed when he was 15. This girl who had broken up with Danny 2 weeks earlier hadn't seen him since, weirdly no one had. The girl was babysitting her sisters and watching Nightmare on Elm Street while her father was out. The movie finished and the girls went off to change for bed. At the same time the dad came home. The youngest, 8 or so, was in her bedroom. She opened her closet and found Danny standing there with a hatchet. He was dressed in her dead mother's clothes with makeup smeared on his face. He told her to be quiet and tied her up. He eventually tied up the whole family in the bedroom. He told them he was going to kill them, he'd be right back so start praying. Thankfully, the youngest was able to wriggle free. She jumped out of the window and ran to the neighbor's house who called the cops before coming back over with a gun to free the family. He freed the dad and the daughters but didn't see Danny. Cops came and couldn't find him either. The family stays with relatives for 2 weeks to get away from the house. In that time nobody's found Danny. Eventually the family must come back home. They drive home from their relatives and pull in their driveway. Only to see Danny standing in the window. The father starts yelling. Neighbors come over and they surround the house. Ops come and search the house. Once again they don't find Danny, but they find a very disturbing scene. Pennies are glued to the ceiling. Strange writings are on the wall. All of their clothes, furniture, and everything else had been jacked off on. They search the house and find nothing until a cop in the basement hears a noise coming from behind the washing machine. Cops rush in and pull the washing machine away from the wall and find a hole. In that hole is Danny. Scary Reddit Stories Part 74. I have a friend who is a trail ranger. Basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands with another actual ranger. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he said he was going to head back as it's a 1-hour ATV ride. Friend finished up the last one when he heard voices. Keep in mind he's far off the beaten path. He called out and no one replied. It was getting dark, so he started to head back and found out that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed that the battery was not connected anymore. He reconnected it and started to drive, but it wasn't going fast at all. Less than half a mile later the whole thing died. He radioed back basically saying, "Hey guys, I need someone to come pick me up." They told him yes, but it would take an hour. He asked if the other guy got back, and they said no. He settled down and started a small fire, but it didn't take long before he heard voices again. It's now dark and the voices are creeping him out. It sounds like an argument, like someone was angry and yelling at someone else who sounded more scared. He called out and asked if anyone needed help. The voices didn't seem to care. He decides to walk towards the voices, but as he was getting closer the voices seemed to be getting further and further away. After 20 minutes he gave up and walked back. He got a radio call and they said the other guy was found passed out covered in vomit and was being taken to the hospital. Then the radio died. Then the voices came back. Scared out of his mind he decided to listen to what they were arguing about, picking up things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take. I don't effing care, you knew better," and so on. His guess was two hunters arguing over a kill. Then he heard one shout something, then silence, then bang. A gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that he heard nothing, just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything, and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours and found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour a shallow grave was found, and in it was a long dead man who had clearly been shot in the face. The creepy thing was that it was a skeleton who had been there for years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home, or he heard the murder of someone from years ago. Scary Reddit Stories Part 65. My uncle used to have a cabin in the woods near Winter, Wisconsin on a relatively undeveloped arm of the Chippewa Flowage. Not too remote that you couldn't pop into town for necessities, but far enough in the boonies that if you got hurt, you'd be in serious trouble. I used to spend time there in the summer tearing through the woods with my 2 cousins. One morning when I was about 10 my uncle woke us up roughly and told us it was time to go fishing. It was still super early and we were all confused because it was pitch dark and who the hell went fishing so early anyway. He hustled us down to the dock where he kept his little fishing boat and quickly launched us into the water and away from the house. At this point we were all getting a little freaked out by the weirdness of the situation. We thought maybe we were being punished because my uncle had gone to chop wood the previous morning and couldn't find his axe anywhere. He'd left it lodged in a stump next to the cabin and accused us of messing with it, which, to be fair, sounded like something we probably would have done. He ended up having to drive into town to buy a new one. He wasn't talking, though. We just sat shivering under a blanket at the bow of the boat while my uncle stared wild-eyed at the shoreline and waved a flashlight furtively ahead of us. We eventually arrived at my uncle's friend's cabin across the lake and tumbled into his house. Our uncle sent us to the loft to sleep, and he and his buddy locked the doors and left, not returning until well after sunrise. Eventually our uncle showed up with a truck and trailer already packed with all of our gear and told us it was time to go home. We all thought it was weird that we were leaving the cabin days early, but we were kids, so we just went with it. My uncle was quiet for the whole long drive back to civilization. Many years later my uncle confided to me that the reason he'd hustled us home was because he'd woken up around 3 a.m. to a strange thok sound from outside the cabin. He'd gone out to investigate when a massive jack pine fell directly across the narrow driveway, locking us in. Startled by the noise, he swept his flashlight along the tree line just in time to see a man holding an axe link away into the dark of the wood. He and his buddy had to take turns chainsawing the tree apart while the other stood watch with a rifle. He never found the axe. Trust Your Gut Feeling Part 95. I lived in South Africa, where home invasions were pretty brittle. I grew up on a plot and lived in the flat adjacent to the main house. One night I woke up randomly around 2 a.m. and had this horrifying feeling that something wasn't right. I opened my flat door to look outside and to see if anything was going on. The feeling didn't go away, so I decided to get dressed and do a walk around the garden. Before leaving my flat, something told me to peep through the door, and as I did, I saw some guy walking in the garden. I then phoned my sister who lived in the house, but no answer. I then phoned my stepmom, but no answer. After a while my sister answered, which was really strange. I told my sister to wake the F up and walk around the house and make sure the doors and windows were closed as there was someone in the garden. She kept trying to blow it off and even said she'd unlock the house door so I could go inside the house. I told her that's a stupid idea and I wasn't going outside because I had nothing to protect myself with. My sister missed a breath during our call, something that usually happens when she's frightened. So out of instinct I asked her if everything was alright. She should say yes twice, but she only said it once. Turns out a group of men had already made it in the house and they had a gun to her head telling her to convince me to leave my flat. A few seconds later the automatic light outside my flat turned on. I then told my sister it's okay and I was going to sleep. I then phoned the police and neighborhood watch, which took the longest 30 minutes of my life to show up. Once I saw the police lights outside, I made a 100 meters dash to the gate to open it up for them. I then talked them over what happened and that we should investigate the house. I walked around the perimeter with them until we found where the guys had entered. We entered the house, which was totally trashed, until we got to the main room where there was a blanket over the bed. I took off the blanket and found my whole family under there, tied up, frightened and shirtless. This included my 1-year-old niece. If it weren't for my instincts they would not have hesitated to kill me and probably do worse to my family. They already poisoned my dogs. Must have been a guardian angel or something looking over my shoulder that night. Trust your gut feeling, part 100. This kid I pretty much grew up knowing for about 15 years was always very creepy and I could never pinpoint why exactly. He was my brother's roommate for a while, he's been inside my house, he's been to my birthday parties, and I have had multiple conversations with him. Fast forward a couple of years, I felt my stomach drop reading this news about him. He had made a Craigslist posting saying he was a talent scout and ran an agency. He got the interest of a father, grandfather and his granddaughter. His specialty was casting families, preferably children, under the guise that he was looking to produce a film and needed actors. The grandfather and his granddaughter went to meet him up at his house. They actually drove by 2 hours early to check out the house before going to it. There was a for sale sign outside the house and it appeared vacant. The family drove by later at the agreed time of meeting in the morning and were greeted at the door by a man in a suit. He tried to convince the little girl to come inside many times. The grandfather observed one room with no furniture and a plastic sheet covering the floor. The grandfather then got a bad feeling about the situation, so he did not allow the child inside. They left and reported the incident to the police. Turns out, the police caught him with 40 counts of CP. His home was raided, and the police found him with a bag with a knife, zip ties, sex toys, and plastic sheeting. He was going to pretty much kill the grandfather, then RIP and MURD3R the child. His plan was to get this all on film. The camera was set up and ready to go. Thankfully, he got sentenced to 885 years in prison, so he won't be getting out anytime soon.